I want to talk about Barcelona, Charlie. This is an absolutely shocking story, a scandalous story, really. And I'm surprised it hasn't made more waves in the English press or the UK press, although perhaps, knowing our obsession with ourselves, maybe I shouldn't be that surprised. But Barcelona have had two players playing in their team this season. They've had Victor Pau and Danny Olmo, and there was a whole question mark about whether they could play these players without breaching financial fair play. And Barcelona said, no, no, we've got the money to pay for them because we have guaranteed income on boxes in our as yet unbuilt new stadium. And there were questions asked by La Liga, the competition that they're playing, saying, well, can you evidence this? And Barcelona initially said, yeah, we've got the money, don't trust us. And this will all be certified. Anyway, they've just recently published their half-yearly account showing an £84 million loss, and they have acknowledged that the €100 million that they said they would receive for these boxes, and on the basis of which they would have stayed within financial fair play, and therefore that would have enabled them to sign these two players. There is no basis for that. And La Liga itself is in uproar. The league says, well, you're in breach. But then Barcelona seem to have the backing of the Spanish government in this row. It's just the most incredible story. And on the face of it, you would say that, well, aren't Barcelona breaking the rules and breaking them to such a degree that perhaps they should be kicked out of La Liga, that they should be kicked out of the Champions League? Is that going too far?
I think this scandal is going to run and run. It's been bubbling under the surface for a while now. Effectively, what we saw was a few years ago, Barca and Real, who have been desperately trying to maintain their financial competitiveness with the big six in England over a long period of time. And I don't know if you remember, they've been doing all sorts of things during that time. They've been forward selling their media rights. They've been forward selling some of their merchandising. They've been doing, they've been robbing Peter to pay Paul, in the most sort of bizarre way for a number of years now. Real have just about got themselves out from under. They've got their new stadium up and running. Now, that does mean they have an enormous debt. I mean, they owe on their stadium, they owe 1.2 billion, which they're going to be paying off over 30 years. Now, Arsenal and Spurs have both been through this recently, and doubtless Man U will be going through it at some point in the future. This tends to mean that you do have a number of years which are pretty uncomfortable because the interest payments combined with the repayment payments on that enormous debt chips away at your ability to compete during that time, because that all comes into your accounts, right? So in terms of your outgoings, you owe a billion. You've borrowed it at, let's keep the numbers round, sort of, 5%. And that means that you've got interest payments of 50 million a year, plus whatever repayment schedule you've enjoined. So let's say it's another 50 million. So you're basically paying 100 million a year for 20 years in order to be able to fund your stadium. In Real's case, they've managed to get the stadium done. The stadium has occasioned a very significant increase in revenues. They've just recently become the first club to break the billion revenue mark, which looks to me like they are going to be able to meet this repayment schedule without having to reduce their cost base, their playing cost base. They have nonetheless still forward sold lots of other revenue streams, etc. It's still going to be a very, very difficult time for a period of years in terms of the Galactico type of sort of signing that they've been used to. And I think we saw this in the wranglings over the Mbappe situation, etc. And if I looked at that team the other night playing against Arsenal, I thought, crikey, this is going to need a reboot at some point, because they were thoroughly, thoroughly beaten. And that didn't look to me like a team that was a team for the next 5 years. It looked to me like it was a team for the last 5 years. But nonetheless, Real, if we're talking about treading through a sort of landmine field, Real seem to have just about managed to get themselves through the landmine field, stay competitive, with by competitive, I mean competitive with the English clubs financially, and to have now a horizon for the next 10 to 20 years by which they might not be able to be quite the same free spending force that they were in the previous generation, but they should still be highly competitive. Barca basically have stepped on the landmines, and they are now desperately trying to hate sort of hopping from one analogy to the other. They're the drowning man clutching at whatever they can, bobbing around in the sea to try and keep themselves afloat, partially from spending rules, but also just partially keep themselves afloat full stop. Because remember that, unlike the clubs that we've just been talking about that are owned by petrostates and by massive multi-billionaires, Real and Barca are owned by their members. So that they don't have the sugar daddy. So they either have to pay for what they're spending out of their revenues, or else they have to borrow it. Now, effectively, Barcelona have reached the end of the road when it comes to borrowing, both borrowing to fund their new stadium, borrowing to forward selling, which is effectively just borrowing, right? What we call factoring, where you say to a bank, you say, right, we are due to get X amount in media revenues over the next 10 years. We will guarantee that those payments go to you if you give us a certain amount of money up front. Well, Barca have been doing that. They haven't managed to get the new camp up and running in the same time frame that Real have done, and they now find themselves falling foul of all sorts of spending regulations. It's worth bearing in mind that La Liga's spending regulations are both tighter and more strictly enforced than the Premier League's.
Can I just say on that though, the taking of money and factoring it in up front is acceptable to La Liga. That you're allowed to say in La Liga, yeah, we've got £100 million. We're booking this €100 million rather than pounds. We're booking this €100 million for boxes from a source which we're not naming for a stadium that isn't yet built. But trust us, we've got that money coming in. La Liga allows you to factor that into your calculations. But UEFA don't allow you to do that as well, which again calls into question their participation, surely, in UEFA's competitions. I also noticed that Barcelona, along with Real Madrid, are still keen on a European Super League. And of course, if you've got financial problems and you're facing pressure from your domestic league, from the European governing body, how can you Houdini-like escape in a single bound? You set up a new competition from which you can never be relegated, or you join a new competition from which you can never be relegated.
Yeah, well, when it comes to the Super League, watch this space. This hasn't gone away. This has not gone away. It is the natural end point of all of these contortions that we're seeing within EU football. I don't include English football amongst that. EU football. We're seeing contortions going on continuously to try to meet various different cost control regimes, or even just pay the bills, or deal with falling TV revenues. There's big looming problems in the French league. Well, not even looming, they're there right now at the moment. But it is just worth noting that the Liga has effectively moved to a revenue-based, cost control mechanism like UEFA's, so that they have already effectively fallen in line with UEFA in a way that the Premier League has tried to kick the can down the road for one more year before they do so. So just to revisit previous podcasts, effectively, those English clubs that want to compete in the European leagues do have to stay within UEFA's rules. They tried to get the rest of the Premier League to join a similar mechanism within the Premier League, and that hasn't, because of the number of clubs required to vote that through, that has not yet been voted through, the replacement of PSR with UEFA squad cost control ratios. But in La Liga, it's happened, right? In La Liga now, it's at 60% or 70% under certain circumstances, which is the UEFA, but by that I mean the percentage of your revenues that you are allowed to spend on your playing expenses, your first team playing expenses. And now, of course, what this does do within the Spanish league is it bakes in a huge advantage for Barca and Real. Barca, we can quibble about Barca's revenues, should they be allowed to include this or that, whatever it might be. But within the Spanish domestic system, their revenues are vastly higher than the other clubs. We just mentioned that Real are up towards $1 billion euros in revenue. So let's call that 800 million, 850 million pounds. And Barcelona is behind that, but it's not a million miles behind that. And we were saying that the top Premier League clubs, 500, 600, 700. So when you're looking at Real and Barca, their revenues are absolutely comparable with and even superior to the big six. And we mentioned earlier on how that might become the big eight. The problem is that the amount of debt that they've stored up in getting themselves into that place is, absolutely colossal. And they forward sold all sorts of things to get to these types of numbers. And therefore, the next 5 to 10 years is going to involve quite a lot of stress. In terms of what happens next with Barca, you mentioned something quite interesting, which is the occasional intervention of the Spanish government in this whole wrangle. Now, there's been a lot of complaints from the Premier League about the new government regulator in England, in English football. But that is very much an arm's length regulator with a mandate established and then independence from the government. Now, I know a lot of Premier League bosses sort of sneer at that, but it's true. I mean, it's a fact that you're not going to see government ministers wading into the regulator's office and telling them, well, you can do this or you can't do that, etc. The only control that our government will have over the regulator is who they actually appoint as the regulator. Now, that's their one little bit of control. What we're seeing in the Spanish system, in the absence of a arm's length regulator, is the government itself getting involved, and that, I think, is extremely dangerous. Now, I don't know if you remember when the English regulator was being set up or being mooted or starting to be framed into a bill, there was a sort of a last minute sort of attempt, I think probably sort of rather initiated by certain forces in the Premier League, to try and get the EU, UEFA, to intervene, saying or FIFA say we don't. Well, I think it was FIFA maybe. We don't like to see governments getting involved in football. Well, what you're seeing in Spain with Barcelona is very much that.
Absolutely. A fascinating situation unfolding. I think we will return to that in a future episode as well. It's one of the joys of doing this podcast, is that these stories are rarely cut and dried. They're organic, they're evolving, and we will keep ahead of them as well, or we will keep across them.